Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you
Hi there, and welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. My name is Jeff Gomez, and in this episode, I'll be looking at 1992's Propeller. But first, let me say that all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices unless otherwise stated. Also, any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators. Special thanks goes out to Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database, which you can find at gbvdb.com. And, of course, all opinions stated are my own. You can also subscribe for future episodes or listen to past episodes at everygbvlp.com. And finally, if you'd like to drop me a line, you can do so by sending an email to jeff@everygbvlp.com. Now let's get to the show. Okay, we're now up to the 5th GBV LP, Propeller. This is, I would argue, the most important record in the lengthy Guided by Voices discography. It's not necessarily their best record, though it's almost that too. For my money, B1000 is their flat-out masterpiece and my own personal favorite, but Propeller comes in a very close second. But that's just for quality. In terms of what it means to the history of the band and how it changed Pollard's life, Propeller simply has to be seen as the moment where the GBV story really begins. And what's of course ironic is that it was actually meant to be the story's end. Bob's final statement is the thing that began his career. Why? Because Pollard intended Propeller to be the last record he ever made. Going into 1992, GBV had existed for almost a decade. They recorded 4 full-length records and an EP, but nothing was happening for the band. There was barely even a band. There was no consistent lineup, and 2 of the guys from the previous LPs, Kevin Fennell and Mitch Mitchell, had left to play with a local hardcore band. Pollard's family thought he was selfish and not just plain nuts for pouring money and time into what they thought was just a hobby. It had gotten to the point to where Pollard agreed with them. Bob later said, "There were people who told me I should focus more of my efforts on teaching, that I shouldn't be using money on music when I should be spending it on my family. So I finally thought I was going to have to become, as some people put it, responsible." And not only was Pollard in debt from the previous records, but so were his friend Pete and his brother Jim. "I realized that we didn't have enough money and couldn't keep financing these records," Pollard said. "We were done. It was settled." But he wanted to go out with a bang. So Bob resolved to make one last record, and he was going to put all of his best songs on it. He was also going to go into a professional studio to record them. The record would be called Propeller because it was the thing that was going to propel the band to stardom. It was meant to be an ironic, if not outright sarcastic title. No one around the band, or even in the band, Bob included, thought the LP would amount to anything. When they were done, Bob promptly broke up the band, kept on teaching, and that was it, except, of course, that it wasn't. Like so much having to do with Propeller, the title would later prove to be prophetic. Pollard was right. It did propel them to stardom, at least on the indie rock level. Within the next year, they'd get signed, start playing shows, and receive glowing reviews. Pollard's dream, the one he'd been carrying around inside of him for decades, was finally coming true. But all of that happened later. At the beginning, Propeller was no different than any of the other records they'd made over the years. In fact, even though we're talking about it as being released in 1992, virtually no one heard it when it first came out. In a Facebook group devoted to 90s music, in a survey of the best records of 92, Propeller came in third behind Sugar's Copper Blue and Pavement's debut, Slanted and Enchanted. But that's revisionist thinking, since Propeller didn't really come out in 1992. That's just the year it was made. Nobody really heard it until the following year, and that was only if you bought the CD version of Vampire on Titus. Propeller wouldn't get its own release for a couple of years. So all of the acclaim the record has since received has all been retroactive. That being said, the few people who did hear it, and I'll talk in a minute about how that happened, connected immediately to the LP, and it's that reaction that paved the way for GBV's eventual discovery. Propeller came out on yet another made-up record label, Rockathon. As Bob has said, all of our albums are on different labels because even though they were realized and financed by us, we wanted people who didn't know us to think we were frustrated with record companies and needed to keep jumping labels for whatever reasons one could care to conjure up. Actually, we just wanted to keep things interesting for us. Rockathon gets a mention in the first line of Propeller's second song, Weed King, Pollard writing, "Long live Rockathon." Funnily enough, Rockathon actually did live long. 25 years later, it's still around. You can go to rockathonrecords.com today and order a wide range of Guided by Voices on Robert Pollard music and merchandise. The name or idea of a rockathon has been around for a long time in relation to various kinds of fundraisers. It's used even today for churches or other organizations who have rockathons to drive donations, although it's usually spelled rock-a-thon instead of it being one word. And the rock doesn't always mean music. A rockathon can also be when, as stated by the website fundraisingideas.org, students ask for pledges from friends, family, and neighbors to see how long they can rock in a rocking chair. This also goes back decades, predating GBV. For example, in 1975, teens in South Houston held a rockathon to raise funds for the Sagemont Baptist Church. According to a newspaper account, they rocked in their chairs for 48 hours, which is only slightly longer than GBV's final show of the Electrifying Conclusion tour. Now, while in past episodes I've talked about what the LP's cover looks like, for Propeller, in terms of when it was actually released, that goes out the window. The reason is because the LP was initially housed in a plain white sleeve, and Bob and the band, along with some friends, then proceeded to hand decorate each sleeve. It took about a month to finish all 500 covers. This means that each copy of the initial pressing of Propeller is a unique work of art. Most of them were also numbered. This is why an original copy of Propeller will cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000. Owning one is like owning an original painting. The Guided by Voices database has a nice gallery of 100 or so of the handmade covers, and they're pretty awesome to look at. It's certainly the holy grail in terms of collecting GBV records. It was given a standalone reissue by Scat in 1996 on vinyl and CD, and then again in 2005. In the most recent reissue, there were 2 LP covers to choose from, featuring designs from Propeller No. 1 and 14. And the CD version has a booklet with a bunch of different covers, so you can essentially choose whichever one you want. Once the copies were all designed, they were divvied up to everyone in and around the band, with each person receiving 10 to 20 copies. And that was supposed to be it. The record was done, the band was done, time for everyone to move on with their lives. But what happened is that manager for life Pete Jameson didn't just hang on to his copies. He sent a few copies to labels and tastemakers, and for those who received it, the record immediately struck a chord. One of those people was musician Matt Sweeney. He was living in New York at the time and was about to start the band Chavez. Chavez would later go on to release a few records on Matador. They got back together just last year and released an EP. Sweeney reached out to Bob, writing that he was embarrassed by how much he liked Propeller, and adding that a creepy obsession with the record immediately seized me and everybody I played it for. He also wrote that GBV is way too great for me to put into words. The fact that Propeller created instant fans is what led a copy to end up in the hands of Robert Griffin, who ran a small label in Cleveland called Scat Records. Griffin liked what he heard and gave Bob a call. This would start a chain of events that would change the course of the band and Pollard's life. This is what makes Propeller the most important record in GBV's history, with Pete Jameson's act of shoving a few copies into envelopes and sending them around the country, the most important event in the Guided by Voices story. Because without that happening, Robert Griffin never calls Bob to ask for a single, which means there's never a request for a full length. With no The Grand Hour or Vampire and Titus, there's no B-1000. In fact, there's nothing else by GBV, not to mention there's no Pollard solo stuff or any of the side projects. No Circus Devils, no Boston Spaceships. All that would exist of Guided by Voices would be those early records, the boxes of which would sit unopened in Bob's basement, stacked in the same place where some of the songs were recorded. We all have our what-if moments. What if we'd done one thing instead of another? How would our lives be different? It's interesting to think what would have happened in Pollard's life if Jameson hadn't sent out those copies of Propeller, but thankfully he did. In terms of who played on the record, in addition to the usual suspects, one new person was Dan Toohey on bass. He played bass previously in Tobin Sprout's pre-GBV band Figure 4, as well as Tobin's post-GBV band Eyes and Weasel. Mitch Mitchell was back, playing guitar this time instead of bass. Jim Pollard plays guitar yet again. Tobin Sprout played on more songs than he ever had, and he was also instrumental in recording a number of songs, not to mention that this record features the one and only true Pollard-Sprout co-write. Break Demos has stuck around from the last record, also playing bass, and Don Thrasher remains on drums. I don't hear Demos' melodic bass lines from the previous record, Same Place the Fly Got Smashed, so either he plays on the majority of the songs, or else the general heaviness of Propeller precluded Demos from being more melodic. With Tobin, Mitch, and Greg being part of the record, but the only person missing from the so-called classic lineup is Kevin Fennell, who didn't play on the record. Also, unlike the previous 4 records, Propeller would be recorded in a number of different places. The past 4 records were recorded in Steve Wilbur's nearby 8-track garage studio, but for Propeller, the band went into a big studio, Encore, to record on 16-track. However, the same as with the first EP, doing this meant they ran into engineers who again didn't approve of the band's recording methods. They also recorded at Cro-Magnon's 8-track studio and then recorded a bunch of stuff in their basements on 4-track. This means that the sound is much more varied than previous GBV records, and the back and forth from song to song and from mid-fi to lo-fi, in my mind, sets the template for their best records such as B-1000. No one's credited as a producer, but the liner notes say the LP was lovingly fucked with by Mike Rep Hummel. Mike Rep, he's also known as Mike Hummel, is a musician himself, having been at it even longer than Pollard. He recorded his first 7-inch, Rocket to Nowhere, in 1975. It was released in 1978 and has since been reissued. You can buy it today from Mighty Mouth Music. And, the same as Pollard, Mike's had his own band and been part of numerous other groups and side projects over the years. As Mike Rep and the Quotas, he's released 3 full-lengths and a bunch of singles, the most recent of which was just a few years ago. Their 1996 release, A Tree Stump Named Desire, was described in a Tape Op magazine review as the warm, fuzzy distortion of a 4-track with all of its meters pegged in the red, producing a rich, noisy, yet harmonically pleasing listening experience. So you can see that Bob went to the right place when getting some help with Propeller. Also, it turns out that lovingly fucking with records is something Mike Rep did for a bunch of bands, including Times New Viking, New Bomb Turks, and Thomas Jefferson Slave Apartments, who later toured with GBV. The website Free Music Archive writes that Mike Rep/Hummel's Lovingly Fucked With, or LFW tag, is a quality seal for those in search of lo-fi treble-smashed garage punk. As Bob says, we took it to Mike Hummel in Columbus to re-EQ everything and give it that in-the-room sound. Mike's very good at that, and he taught us a lot. It turned out to be the crucial ingredient missing from their previous records. This shows that GBV's much vaunted lo-fi sound was much more of an aesthetic choice than merely the byproduct of recording on a 4-track or in a basement. I'll talk about this more in the next episode when I look at what is probably GBV's most raw-sounding record, Vampire on Titus. Once again, and for the last time in GBV's history, there were no contemporary reviews of Propeller. However, in 2005, while reviewing what Pitchfork called the overdue reissue of the 1992 lo-fi classic, they wrote, B-1000 is written about more often and exalted more devotedly, and rightly so. But Propeller proves just as essential to the Guided by Voices mythos. More than that, it's just a solid rock album, one that gives you all the tools you need to understand and appreciate it. While I don't agree with some of the other reviews Pitchfork's given to GBV or Pollard's solo work, I totally agree with their assessment here. It's the heaviest record GBV had made up to that point, and it will remain the heaviest for quite a while. Propeller has 15 songs and clocks in at about 36 minutes. B-1000, even though it has 20 songs, was barely 30 seconds longer. That being said, almost half of Propeller's songs are under 2 minutes. But unlike what I would call the song fragments of Alien Lanes, Propeller's short songs are just that, songs that feel complete, not unlike early Beatles or Buddy Holly, from the era when pop songs rarely went past the 3, let alone 2-minute mark. Similar to their previous LP, Same Place the Fly Got Smashed, Propeller opens not with a song, but with voices.
Did anybody
It sounds, of course, like a concert, a live recording of GBV playing a triumphant gig for a mass of adoring fans. But it's all an illusion. Scott Camberg of Pavement asked Bob a few years after the record came out, what concert was that? And Bob just laughed and told him it was faked in the studio by the band and some friends. As Pollard says, we weren't even a live band at that point. We'd quit playing live. We hadn't played live for like 5 years. This is one of the things I love about this record and about Guided by Voices in general. That chant of GBV is now a real thing. You hear it when you go to their shows. The illusion has become real. Pollard, by not giving up, by having a bit of luck, has managed to make his dream a reality. In terms of the first song, Over the Neptune Mesh Gear Fox, I have to say that it's not only a great song to open this album, but it's one of the best songs to open any album by any band ever. I have to also say that it's my all-time favorite GBV song. It's an anthem, it soars, it rocks. It even goes quiet at one point and has some violin. But it's also, like the chant at the beginning, not just a song, but a mission statement. One that eventually set the course, if not predicted, the future of the band. Pollard writes, "Hey, let's throw a great party today for the rest of our lives. The fun is just about to get started, so throw the switch, it's rock and roll time." Bob's inviting us all to a party with GBV as the house band. And yet it's a fantasy, a myth, because there was no band and there was no party. It's like how Oasis sang about being rock and roll stars on the first song of their first record. The irony was that they weren't rock and roll stars. They were nobodies from Manchester on a small label. But in no time, they were the biggest band in England. What they were singing about came true. And yet, Pollard's invitation isn't as glamorous as what Oasis was offering. Bob admitting to his fellow travelers that, "You must be willing just to ride along with me. You must be happy just to do the job for free. It might be fun, but it's fun on Bob's terms." And as Pollard repeatedly cites in his work, it comes at a cost. It's yours for the taking, but only if you follow certain rules. Rules which Bob and the band had constantly refused. Playing live, getting out of Dayton, or just plain leaving the whole daydream of being in a band behind. But then Pollard sticks up for himself and his vision, protesting at the song's most anthemic point, "I'm much greater than you think." In the song's swooning second half, Pollard turns uncharacteristically sentimental, writing, "Time's wasting and you're not gonna live forever. And if you do, I'll come back and marry you." But even this comes at a price, Pollard adding, "No use changing now. It's marriage on his terms. Pollard can only be himself." Sonically speaking, this is the best sounding song GBV had recorded up to that point. It's a big sound for a big song. He's finally approaching the arena rock ambition of his heroes like The Who. Pollard's singing also sounds amazing, and you begin to hear the English accent kicking in. At 5 minutes and 41 seconds, it's actually one of the longest songs GBV ever recorded, but as written, it was actually longer. The original song was 11 minutes. That's longer than several of their early EPs. It was called Special Astrology for the Warlock Tour. In demo form, the first two parts of the song were the same as what's on Propeller. The third section is essentially Circus World, which appears on side 2 of Propeller. This then segues into a version of Tractor Rape Chain, which is known as the Clean It Up version, since that's what he says at the end. From there it goes into Class Clown Spots the UFO. This song wouldn't be properly recorded or released until 20 years later in 2012 for the record of the same name. It's mind-boggling to me that not only does Pollard write so many damn songs, but that he manages to keep track of them all to the degree that, more than 2 decades after he wrote it, he brought it back. Plus, even in the primitive form of the original demo, Class Clown has the harmonies and background vocals that would end up on the final version. Next up is Weed King. This is a slow burner of a song. It starts off slow and slightly spare, but ends up sounding massive. It's a great song, although coming after a whole record about alcohol, it feels incongruous for Pollard to be singing the praises of weed. Third song is Particular Damaged. This is definitely a 4-track song, if not straight from Bob's boombox. I have no idea what it's about, but it's kind of fun to listen to. Fourth song is Quality of Armor. This is supposedly the first song Pollard ever wrote on a guitar back in 1986. He said that it's about defense mechanisms like, how is your armor? Can you deal with it? He also says the lyrics are ridiculous, but I like them. The line, you are finding God in the dictionary, never fails to bring a smile to my face, as does, the worst defense is intelligence, the best defense is belligerence. Next is Metal Mothers.
There's no dark spot running around your face. You find time to get laid. You find ways to get paid.
This is a solid song with some nice guitar, probably played by Greg Demos, since Pollard has said that he's the most accomplished musician in the band. It has lyrics about rock stars and getting laid, so the metal of the title is probably heavy metal. One of Pollard's first bands, Anacrusis, was a heavy metal band. The final song on side 1 is Lethargy.
Are you happy? Happy today? Is your face mask on? Oh, the air is thick as the clouds are moving so slowly.
It's a short, heavy rocker that's a lot of fun, with Pollard really shredding on the vocals. When I saw them in New York on their first reunion tour of the so-called classic lineup in 2010, Mitch Mitchell sang this while wearing a football helmet. The line, I wish I could give a shit just a little bit, is pretty classic Pollard. There's also a line about the book of instructions to the rusty time machine. For a while, the working title of B-1000, when it was intended to be a double album, was Instructions to the Rusty Time Machine. Side 2 kicks off with Unleashed, the Large-Hearted Boy. It's a fun song, though Bob's vocal is a bit sloppy and all over the place. It has the line, driven to the fields, whipped like a slave. Pollard uses slave imagery a bit in his work. The previous GBV record had a song called Order for the New Slave Trade, and he'd later have a song on a 2007 solo record called When We Were Slaves. This song would later provide the name for the website Large Hearted Boy, which looks at literature and music. Next up is Red Gas Circle. This quiet acoustic song provides the first relief from the overall heaviness of the record, and the shift from Unleashed to this song, the variety of sounds and songs you find on their records, is why a lot of people like GBV, especially the early stuff. Next is Exit Flagger. This is just Bob and Toby, Pollard having called up Sprout all excited one morning to tell him he had a great new song. We went down to my basement and threw it together, Sprout later said. He played the drums and I played pretty much everything else. Pollard says of the song, I think it's about going through life confused and not certain of what's going on because of all of the bullshit involved in it, until you get to the point where you die. The exit flagger is the Grim Reaper. In the song, the narrator says he promises to meet the exit flagger one of these days, but just not today. Next is 14 Cheerleader Cold Front.
14 cheerleader cold front, put your nose beyond, creeping boys in alleys.
This is pretty much the only song Pollard and Sprout ever wrote together, Sprout having the melody and Pollard supplying the lyrics, and the two of them working out the song on the spot. It's a really lovely song and a much-deserved fan favorite. Bob and Toby later collaborated outside of GBV on the Airport 5 project, but that was the same as the rest of Pollard's collaborations. Sprout did the music on his own, and Pollard later provided vocals, Bob's called this way of working easy. Asked why they don't try and write together more often, given the stellar results of this song, Tobin answered, "I'm not sure. It just seems to work well the way things are going, but I don't think it's out of the question that it could happen." The song's title came to Pollard while he was at a high school basketball tournament. He counted all of the cheerleaders on the court, and there were 14 of them. And because they seemed sort of stuck up and more into themselves than the game, Bob said, "Look at the 14 cheerleader cold front." He later said of the title that it's probably my favorite. The next song is Back to Saturn X Radio Report. It's actually a bunch of snippets from other songs, 10 in total. The Wikipedia page for Propeller lists them all, as well as where you can find the original versions, and the title, Back to Saturn X, was in the running to be the name of either an LP or an EP in 1992. That same year, They Might Be Giants did something similar, stitching together 21 short snippets in the song Fingertips on their record, Apollo 18. Next is Ergo Space Pig. It's an okay song. It has a wah-wah guitar solo towards the end that kind of wears out its welcome. Next up is Circus World. It's a stone. Understand me. After a string of lo-fi 4-track songs, this one sounds like it was recorded in a studio. Lyrically, it's pretty sad and angry. A lot of the songs on the second side were written as they were recording the record, and since this was a period where Pollard had basically decided to give up the band, some of these final songs depict his mindset. He talks about almost reaching his limit, saying, "If I were a freak who self-destructs." He then rails against the establishment, all those painted sluts training monkey men. The song also speaks to his frustration of not being able to achieve his dreams or to penetrate the music business, writing, "I call to the door, but they won't let me in." It's very much of a castigating, score-settling song, the same as Dylan's Positively 4th Street. After a faster middle section, the song ends in a contemplative, almost sentimental mood, Pollard writing, "Daylight breaks, I see a face that used to cry. Where were you then? Somewhere off to yourself." He ends the song by lamenting, "There's too many people involved in the game," the dour music implying that Pollard's not one of them. Next, the last song is Some Drilling Implied. I dare not say the way I feel. The song's title later inspired the name for GBV's now out-of-print home video entitled Some Drinking Implied. Similar to Circus World, this is a bitter and angry song. Pollard, who felt betrayed by his family at the time and had probably stopped sharing anything GBV related with him, writing, "I dare not say the way I feel." He talks about dying, about being chewed up and spit out. The song ends by addressing the fantasy creep. Fantasy Creeps was one of the song snippets of Back to Saturn X Radio Report. In the song, Bob says that the fantasy creeps are here to hound you. This seems like a reference to his own dream of making it as a musician. He was, at this point, on the brink of giving up that fantasy, but he was savvy enough to know that he'd never really get away from it, that the dream would always be there, gnawing at him, hounding him, as the song says. And yet he's complicit. After all, it's his fantasy. It reminds me of the line in Weed King, "We conjure ghosts, and then we feed them." We keep things in our lives we know are unhealthy. If we starved the ghosts, maybe they'd go away, but we don't. We, as Pollard says, feed them, and that keeps them healthy and around. It's like a loose tooth. It hurts, but you love wiggling it too much to pull it out. Final song is On the Tundra. On the tundra, we went under, we're going under now, on the tundra. The record goes out on a total high note after a couple of heavy and depressing songs. It's the perfect way to end the record, and even though it's more upbeat than the previous pair of songs, it deals with some of the same subjects. It also harkens back to the mission statement of the first song. Whereas over the Neptune, Mesh Gear Fox promised a great party that would last forever, on the Tundra it merely hopes for it, Bob writing, and then one day, maybe today, we'll justify the joke, make it our day. He knows the band's a joke, a fantasy. He references the financial hole GBV had put him in, saying that he'd blown his savings on what had turned out to be a blunder. He knows he's made mistakes. But the song also features some great Pollard wordplay, with lines that wouldn't be out of place on Sgt. Pepper's, like, "The foxy wildest monster's dial is more peaceful than a human hammer, the great pretend transmissionaries." The song hasn't been played live since 1994, but there's a video on YouTube of the band playing it at a club called the Kybert in 1993, and it sounds amazing. You can hear and buy Propeller today via all the usual means, and you can also still get it on CD from Scat Records at scatrecords.com for a mere $9. As a final thought, let me say again that this is a truly indispensable record in the history of GBV because without it, the history of Guided by Voices would have ended in 1992. It's a sad thing to think about, and I'm glad we don't have to, because Pete Jameson did send out some copies of Propeller, and that has led us to where we are today, with Pollard having put out over 100 records and me sitting here, 25 years later, talking about a band that Bob broke up. Okay, that's it for Propeller. And as we finish up talking about this record, we also finish talking about the first period of the band, the pre-scat self-released years. They were the years where the band formed and almost ended. In the next episode, I'll be looking at LP number 6, 1993's Vampire on Titus. It was the first GBV record to be widely available, and to some ears, it's a lo-fi masterpiece. Tobin Sprout called it beautiful songs captured on sandpaper, so be sure to catch it. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.